Welcome to Cause Before Symptom, uncovering the real cabal and spiritual forces that are controlling the world. And now, here is your host, James Carner.
Welcome to Cause Before Symptom. I'm your host, James Carner. Today is December 20th, 2025, and tonight's episode is all about sovereignty. I received a book from Urban, and the book talks about a bunch of families in my own state, in Oregon, and how the state itself took away the land of the people due to state law, and they tried to argue sovereignty, and some actually got their property back and some didn't. And I thought it was quite interesting, so I started downloading as many books as I can on sovereignty, and I thought it would make a really good show to understand the sovereignty illusion. Why trying to beat the system doesn't make you free. You can beat the system. Sovereignty is not a bad thing, okay? But I argue that there's a time and a place to use your sovereignty. And we're going to explain the history of sovereignty and what it is and why arguing maritime land law is either great if you understand and have the knowledge behind you and the documentation to prove your case, or bad if you're going up against a corrupt county, a corrupt judge, a corrupt city. And that's so normal. So we're going to talk about all that tonight. Shout out to everybody on the live chat Rumble. Number one warrior is Boots Hafner. Boots saying, hello, Pastor James of the Rumble Airwaves and creator of Elite Potion. Yes, Elite Potion. Get rid of parasites and heavy metals. It's a great Christmas gift, too. Don't delay. It removes parasites, heavy metals. This is Whimsy Worm Wash and Nickel Nixer Elixir, and this is my product. And you can go to elitepotion.com and buy it for a relative if you want. And hey, look, there are lots of parasite and heavy metal cleanses that are out there, but they don't come together. This one, it's together. And, well, they do the miracle of it. Ask Boots. Boots took it, says he feels amazing. All right, number two warrior is Scorpion. Scorpion saying, hey, everyone, glad to be here with you again. Hey, good to have you here, Scorpion. Love you, buddy. And Robert Gerdison says, hi, everyone. El Jaime El Carnero. I remember when I had that up there. I tried that. That was right around the time when I was jumping off of the Trump train and getting away as far as possible from the satanic Trump. And getting out of the illusion of left and right and just surrendering everything to God and just love my neighbor. And I think it made the show better because I don't want to be trapped between left or right politics, because I've been able to prove that there are elite families that control both left and right. And it's all through banking systems. And we've done enough shows to prove that the Bank for International Settlements is the one that is the central bank of all central banks, and they control everyone. So anyway, it just so happens to be close to Christmas. We're a couple more days left. I know a lot of people are doing holiday shopping right now as we speak, late on a Saturday night, running. And that's just funny. And I was actually at a restaurant today before I went and helped a friend with the Rife machine that I currently have now. And I was talking to the waitress and I said, and it just dawned on me, why am I even saying this? This is such a stupid expression. Are you ready for Christmas? We don't just say Merry Christmas, Merry Christmas, Merry Christmas, Feliz Navidad. Hey, happy holidays. No, what we do is we say, are you all ready for Christmas? It's like we set it up for a really bad expectation, because most people will say, well, I'm not really set up. I'm not really ready. And that's pretty much the truth. Nobody is. So if you want to be a comedian like me, just say those words and then watch how people will fumble and say, oh, no, I'm not ready. And it's funny. All right, guys, let's get into crappy, shitty, breaking news.
Welcome to Shitty Breaking News with your host, James Carner, offering his shitty opinion.
So I literally typed in news and it just screwed me over. What's in the Epstein files? Documents mention Trump, Clinton, celebrities. Yeah, they're all pedophiles. That's all I have to say about that. U.S. Coast Guard boards tanker carrying Venezuelan oil, saying this belongs to the United States of America. Trump needs to lower the oil prices to make himself look good. I've been hearing a lot of people saying, oh my God, this is World War III. America's going to attack Venezuela. No. They're just posturing and stealing the oil and seeing what China will do. If China and Russia bring in their boats and they start firing on American ships, then we'll know that they're serious, that they want to keep control of the new Silk Road that China has built in Venezuela. So this is just feather puffing and us lying and saying that they owe us land. That they how did Venezuela steal American land? You know. But again, this is all about ports. Remember I told you, the whole National Guard, of sending the National Guard, was not about protesters. It was about ports, okay? Those who control the ports control the world. And ports are still the number one currency market. And so Trump has declared war against the Democrats who are working for China. And China is gaining on their socialistic and communistic agenda to turn America into a different country. So this is all the stuff that I've done research on. Feel free to go do your own. Apple, Google tell workers on visas to avoid leaving U.S. amid Trump immigration crackdown. Yeah, if you leave, you're not going to come back. So stay and we'll pay you cheap labor like we have been. Cheap labor is not going to work anymore. Okay. People want more than what the companies want to pay. So we're gonna find the companies will put all their money towards robots and AI, and we're going to be left holding our dicks in our hands. That's what's going to happen. Photos of Kennedy Center adds Trump's name to Memorial Congress created for JFK. We got to put Trump in there, you know, because he thinks he's the best president in the world. And extreme wind power outage all across America. It happened, in my hometown. Actually, there was some extreme wind, and it is what it is. When you play with the weather, you get problems like this. EU leaders to loan $90 billion to Ukraine, but fail to agree on using Russian assets. I think it's a bad idea for Europe to use seized Russian money that is owed to Russia to fight against Russia. That, in my opinion, is a declaration of war. But it's up to Russia if they want to take on the EU. Now, do you think the EU can get together with all of their bullets and start a war? No, I don't think that they have enough. They need America, and America just isn't gonna jump into that. I don't know if this is Trump puffing up his chest against Europe, because I do know he's working for the Orsini clan. So regardless, it's all about money. Follow the money and you'll figure out what's going on. California officials alarmed as Trump targets National Weather Research Center. Well, okay, beyond alarmed. You guys screwed with him, and he's going to screw with you. He's back, and he's got 3 more years to mess everything up for you if you're a Trump hater. In my opinion, get out of their way. And that's breaking news. When we come back, we're going to be talking about sovereignty, its illusion, and why beating the system doesn't make you free. So, stick around.
Paying federal income tax is voluntary. So why has every person you know done it their entire lives? You were told it's the law, but the system was built on a lie hidden in plain sight, that you are required by law to pay. The truth is, 98% of Americans don't owe income tax by law. Federal income tax is for federal employees. For everyone else, it's voluntary. You agreed to pay when you signed your first tax return, and you've been renewing that contract every year since. Sounds too good to be true? You're asking, why doesn't everyone know this? Because almost everyone signed before they were old enough to understand it. It's time to unlearn the lie and break free from IRS jurisdictions, protect your assets, and keep more of what you earn legally. Visit unincorporatedassociations.com now and become tax-free.
20 states allow you to set up an unincorporated association. There's no reason why you shouldn't. All the banks do it this way, and they do it to save money. It's the truth. All right, guys, we have a long show here, so I have to talk fast throughout the whole thing because we got a lot to cover. So I'm going to speed through this, and forgive me, but every show that I do, I normally have like at least 3 hours worth of content. And there's times when I have the 3 hours full and I got to do it all within an hour and a half. So I got to rush this thing. So we're going to be talking about sovereignty here and its illusion. And I want people to understand that it's not bad to go and use sovereignty, but there's a point where you could get yourself hurt and you could get in trouble, because just because you're right against the system doesn't mean that they care. And they can do things against you where they feel that they have legal stance. So unless you're really good at arguing sovereignty and understanding both maritime and land laws, you're not going to win. So you have to be careful. Now, there's a moment when people stop believing the system is fair and start believing it can be beaten. And that moment, I think, is very dangerous, not because the instinct is wrong, because I agree to fight for your country, but because of what usually follows after. When trust collapses, people reach for technique. They learn phrases, procedures, filings, and arguments that promise relief. They even go sign up for sovereign seminars, webinars, and pay money to learn about being sovereign. And sometimes those methods actually work. That's not a bad thing. And a charge can disappear, if you get pulled over for, something that you didn't do, and you can use sovereignty to argue your case. A case can actually collapse and a bureaucrat can actually back down. And in those moments, it feels like freedom has been reclaimed. But tonight is not about denying that those moments ever happen. Tonight is about telling the truth that almost no one wants to hear. Beating the system does not mean you are free. And it does not mean the system is illegitimate only when it loses, okay? We have to understand the whole thing before we just jump into it blindly. Now, sovereignty has become one of the most misused words of our time. It is spoken as if it were a spell or a declaration or a legal posture that can be adopted by anyone clever enough to learn the language. But sovereignty was never a trick. It was never a loophole. It was never something you asserted over others or even over yourself in isolation. Sovereignty, in its original sense, was authority tied to responsibility, land, and moral order. That's the legal definition of it. And it flowed from God to people, from people to stewardship, and from stewardship to law. And it was not freedom from obligation, it was obligation under authority. Meaning, if you do declare you're sovereign, you have to take care of what you are responsible for. Now, what changed was not humanity, but the structure of power. As nations shifted from land-based societies to commercial and imperial systems, or international corporations, authority slowly detached from place, from inheritance, and covenant. Law became, actually, for lack of a better word, mobile. Jurisdiction became abstract, and governance became administration. Now, this did not happen because evil men woke up one morning and decided to enslave the world, even though they did. It happened because systems built for commerce and scale require flexibility, efficiency, and control. Over time, truth became secondary to procedure, and justice became something processed rather than discerned. Now, modern courts are not temples of truth. They are administrative machines. They run on standing, jurisdiction, consent, and compliance. And when those inputs are disrupted, the machine can stall. And that is why some sovereign arguments actually succeed. Not because the system has been exposed as false, but because it has been exposed as mechanical. A machine can fail without admitting it was wrong. And when that happens, people mistake malfunction for liberation. And then after they win their case, they think, hey, we're all liberated now. They go right back to 101, lies. Now, this is where the illusion begins. Procedural victories feel like proof that the system has no authority. But the same system that dismisses one case will enforce another without hesitation. And it does not care about consistency. It cares about function. It tolerates anomalies. It does not tolerate challenges to its existence. And it will always recover because it was designed to manage populations, not to answer moral questions. Now, the most dangerous lie in modern sovereignty culture is the idea that freedom can be engineered. That if you learn enough law, enough language, enough history, that you can step outside the system entirely. But there is no outside. There is only deeper awareness of where you stand. Knowing how to navigate corruption does not undo corruption. Knowing how to exploit a procedure does not restore authority. It simply gives you momentary leverage inside a structure that remains unchanged. So something more has to be done than just winning your argument. Scripture never teaches that freedom comes from winning arguments with power. Christ did not defeat Rome by challenging jurisdiction. He exposed false authority by refusing to ground truth in it at all right? His kingdom was not built on legal recognition, but on obedience, discernment, and submission to God, rather than men. And that is why his freedom could be taken, even when his life was. Sovereignty, in the deepest sense, is not declared. Sovereignty is lived. Now, this does not mean knowledge is useless. Understanding the system can reduce harm. It can buy time. It can protect you from the narrow circumstances. But when people begin to worship technique, they lose sight of reality. They start chasing paper freedom while ignoring the deeper loss of moral authority, stewardship, and truth. They confuse cleverness for wisdom and resistance for restoration. The hard truth is this: sovereignty was not stolen by documents. It was surrendered when authority was traded for management, when responsibility was replaced by compliance, and when truth stopped being the foundation of law. You can beat the system and still be trapped by it. You can win the case and lose your freedom. And until that distinction is understood, well, the illusion will keep claiming new believers. And tonight is not about teaching you how to fight the machine. It is about making sure you do not make a mistake that, or do not make a broken cog for a broken God, right? Because real sovereignty was never something the system could give you, and it is not something it can ever restore. Now, what most people never stop to ask is why the idea of sovereignty feels so urgent right now. People do not obsess over sovereignty when authority is trustworthy. They reach for it when something feels artificial, when rules feel detached from justice, and when power no longer answers the truth. And in that vacuum, sovereignty becomes a promise, a way to regain control in a world that feels increasingly managed rather than governed. And this is why so many are drawn to stories of courtroom victories, dismissed charges, and procedural reversals. They are not really chasing law, they are chasing relief. Now, the first thing that has to be understood is that sovereignty did not originate as a personal escape hatch. It was never a declaration someone made to stand above others or outside society. Sovereignty originally described where authority rightfully rested. It was inseparable from land, from responsibility, and moral accountability. And to be sovereign did not mean to be unanswerable. It meant to be answerable to the highest authority and therefore bound to act justly. Authority and obligation were not opposites, as they were the same thing viewed from different sides. It's in its earliest form. Sovereignty was grounded. It was tied to place, inheritance, and stewardship. Land mattered because it anchored responsibility. A ruler, a people, or a household, we're talking like around the Dark Ages, right? A household could not claim authority without bearing the consequences of how that authority was used. Law existed to protect life, order, and continuity, not to optimize systems or extract compliance. And this is why ancient law was slow, local, and relational. Justice required knowledge of people in place, not just adherence to procedure. Now, the modern confusion begins when sovereignty is reduced to autonomy. When people say they want sovereignty today, they usually mean freedom from interference, freedom from obligation, or freedom from consequences. But that was never sovereignty. That was license. Sovereignty was never about escaping responsibility. It was about carrying it rightly. When responsibility disappears, authority becomes hollow, even if it still wears official robes. And here we start to get into things like anarchy. And this matters because many sovereignty arguments fail at the root. Even when they succeed on paper, they are built on the assumption that authority is illegitimate simply because it can be challenged procedurally. But authority does not vanish when it is exposed as mechanical. It simply reveals what it has already become. A system can be corrupted and still function. A law can be unjust and still be enforced. The presence of flaws does not negate power. It only explains how that power operates. Now, before any discussions of courts and jurisdictions or legal tactics make sense, this foundation has to be very clear. Sovereignty is not something that can be recreated by language alone, because it was not destroyed by language alone. It eroded when authority detached from truth, when law detached from land, and when responsibility was replaced with administration. Until that loss is understood, every attempt to reclaim sovereignty will make surface victories for restoration and symptoms for causes. Now, I have interviewed many people on sovereignty. Russell-J. Gould, for example, twice. I also interviewed Kirk, who talks about sovereignty with unincorporated associations. And I also spoke to, what was her name? Ivana something. And basically, yes, sovereignty does work when it comes to credit cards and things like that. But what I'm saying is, it's not going to stop corruption. If your responsibility and you feel in your heart it is to stop corruption, then you have to expose evil on its surface. You have to expose evil in its roots. And you have to do exactly what I do. Put up a show, do your research, and then put that information out there. And this is things that a lot of people just don't have time to do. And I understand. But the shift away from true sovereignty did not happen through a single betrayal or a hidden switch being flipped. It actually happened gradually through convenience, expansion, progression, and necessity. As societies grew larger and commerce, like goods going back and forth, we're talking about what we buy on average 5 to 10 things a day, just putting in our home, whether groceries or beer or whatnot. Well, as societies grew larger and commerce began to stretch beyond local land and custom, authority had to adapt to movement. Trade crossed borders, ships crossed oceans. Obligations could no longer be tied solely to soil and face-to-face accountability. So law followed commerce, and sovereignty began to drift from land toward contracts, ports, and paper. This is why ports are so important. This is where the maritime and commercial logic quietly replaced land-based authority. Law became something portable. Jurisdiction became something abstract, and responsibility became something transferable. What mattered was no longer who you were in relation to land and community, but how you were classified within the system. Personhood itself began to be defined administratively. Names, records, registrations, and instruments replaced living relationships. And none of this required malice. It required efficiency, as empires cannot function on covenant, just a simple handshake. They function on actual management, where things go in the same direction and at the same pace with the same information. Now, over time, governance stopped resembling stewardship and started resembling risk control. The purpose of law shifted from preserving justice to maintaining order. Courts evolved accordingly. They were no longer places where truth was sought in context, but arenas where procedures were evaluated. Standing, jurisdiction, compliance, and consent, they became more important than substance. And this is not a moral judgment. It is a structural reality, as administrative systems cannot survive if every case requires moral discernment. They survive by standardizing outcomes. Now, once authority becomes administrative, legitimacy changes shape. Power no longer needs to be right. It only needs to be followed. Obedience replaces consent. Compliance replaces trust. And when legitimacy erodes, systems compensate by increasing complexity. The more distant authority becomes from truth, the more layers it builds between itself and the people. Forms replace faces, rules replace relationships, enforcement replaces agreement. Now, this is the modern world that sovereignty arguments are born into. They're not arising in a healthy system that needs correction. They are arising in a system that has already accepted that authority, and accepted that that authority is procedural rather than moral. That's the problem. When people discover this, they feel betrayed. It's like red pilling them. Oh my God, everyone's corrupt. Yep. They realize the rules are not what they were taught they were, like in school. Like I had no idea that, every police, the station will favor rich people because power corrupts. And that realization creates fear, anger, and the desire to reclaim control by any means available. And this is why people like Russell-J. Gould and his ex-partner who passed away, David-Wynn Miller, started their thing back in 1999 and was successful to a certain point. But here is the critical distinction that must be made. A system can be administrative without being fragile. It can be morally hollow and still extremely durable. In fact, systems that no longer answer to truth often become more resilient because they are not constrained by conscience. They adapt, they override, they suspend, and redefine themselves whenever necessary. Emergency powers, special jurisdictions, and exceptions are not flaws in the system. They are just simple features. Now, understanding this is essential, because it explains why exposing corruption does not collapse authority. It explains why courts continue to function even when their foundations are questioned. It explains why sovereignty arguments can be acknowledged in one moment and ignored in the next. The system does not depend on coherence. It depends on continuity, meaning if everyone continues to follow the law. And by the time people begin arguing sovereignty, the shift has already happened. Authority has already moved from land to ledger, from truth to process, from stewardship to management. And what remains is not sovereignty in its original sense, but an apparatus designed to administer life at scale. And until that reality is faced, every attempt to reclaim sovereignty will be aimed at the wrong target, fighting the surface mechanics of a system whose deeper transformation occurred generations ago. Now, this is the point where the conversation usually turns practical and where many people feel the strongest pull. Once it is understood that modern authority is administrative, the natural response is to ask how that machinery can be challenged. Well, this is where jurisdictional arguments, consent doctrines, standing challenges, and so-called strawman distinctions enter the picture. And this is where honesty is actually required. These arguments sometimes work, not symbolically, not hypothetically, but they work in real courtrooms, in real cases, with real consequences. They work because administrative systems are rule-bound. They rely on classification, process, and delegated authority. When an agent exceeds that authority, when jurisdiction is improperly asserted, or when procedure is not followed directly, the system can fail to proceed. A case can be dismissed without the underlying issue ever being resolved. From the outside, this looks like victory over power. It feels like exposure. It feels like liberation. But for someone who has been crushed or ignored by bureaucracy, that moment can feel profound. But what it actually is happening is, in those moments, is not the restoration of sovereignty. It is the interruption of a process. The machine did not confess wrongdoing. It did not concede illegitimacy. It simply encountered a deficit and defect that it could not correct in that instance. That distinction matters because systems that operate mechanically can fail locally while remaining intact globally. A stalled cog does not stop the engine. It only pauses one operation. And this is why the same arguments that succeed once can fail spectacularly the next time. I'm just trying to warn you guys if you go down this direction. And by all means, don't give people your fingerprint, even Apple. The system adapts. Procedures change. Jurisdiction is reasserted differently. Statutes are amended. New rules are layered on top of old ones. And what felt like a breakthrough is just quietly being absorbed, documented, and neutralized. The individual walks away thinking they have found the key, while the system logs the anomaly and just moves on, and they don't care. The deeper danger is psychological. This is important. When people experience a procedural win, they often attach meaning to it that it cannot bear. They begin to believe they have stepped outside the system, when in reality they are still entirely inside it, just navigating it more skillfully. They confuse leverage with authority. They confuse disruption with freedom. And over time, they build an identity around opposition to a structure that still defines the boundaries of their life. This is also where the movement fractures. Some double down, believing greater mastery will lead to permanent liberation. Others burn out after realizing the victories are inconsistent and just temporary. And a few are crushed when the system finally decides to enforce itself without tolerance. And many are actually left confused, wondering why something that worked before suddenly just stopped working. Well, the answer is simple, but uncomfortable. The system was never conceded ground. It was just managing risk. Procedural arguments do not expose illegitimacy in the way that people think they do. They expose design. They show that authority today is not moral, but operational. That does not make it weak. It makes it adaptable. And an adaptable system is far more difficult to confront than a tyrant who must pretend to be just. Let me give you a quick example. If you can break the system where they don't have paperwork to fill out for whatever thing you're arguing, then you break the system for the day, and that's it. And they're just going to close the case and move on. But it doesn't mean they're going to close up shop and admit to their guilt. And this is why some people will just drivel and just speak all kinds of drivel that in their heads they think is all kinds of cases. And the judge just says, I can't argue with this because I'm not in the mood. And they just close the case, and then they think they win, and they feel psychologically empowered. But that's a problem. We can't just pretend to be just. And this is why understanding sovereignty only at the level of tactics is very dangerous. It trains people to fight symptoms rather than causes. And isn't that what my show is all about? Isn't that what it's all about? Hey, Buddha Clinton, love you too, buddy. How's Africa doing? It trains people to fight symptoms rather than causes. It keeps them enraged with the machinery rather than asking why the machinery replaced stewardship in the first place. And until that question is faced, every victory will be provisional, every loss devastating, and every sense of freedom dependent on the next procedural flaw rather than on something stable and real. At this stage, the illusion hardens because the conversation actually shifts from law to belief. This is psychological. People begin to believe that if the system can be beaten, then it must be illegitimate only when it loses. Yeah. This is the most subtle deception of all. It reframes power as something that only exists when it succeeds, rather than something that exists because it is enforced. Now, authority does not vanish when challenged. It reveals its nature when challenged. And what it reveals in these moments is not weakness, but just a simple indifference. Administrative systems do not require moral legitimacy to operate, okay? They require participation. They function because people comply, not because people consent. And when compliance falters, the system does not repent. It escalates, it reroutes, or suspends its own rules. And this is why emergency powers exist. This is why exceptions are written into the law. This is why rights can be paused, reinterpreted, or overridden without contradiction. The system is not breaking its own rules when it does this, it is just simply exercising them. And this is where many well-meaning people lose their footing. They believe corruption is proof of failure, when in reality, corruption is often proof of maturity in a system that has learned how to survive scrutiny. A morally grounded system collapses when exposed because it depends on trust. A morally hollow system becomes stronger when exposed because exposure clarifies who will comply and who will resist. That information is invaluable to administrators because they can record it. Now, the illusion of sovereignty thrives here because people assume that uncovering hypocrisy will produce accountability. But hypocrisy is not a bug in modern governance. It's just a feature. Sovereignty is invoked when convenient, ignored when inconvenient, and redefined when necessary. Courts uphold principles when they can and discard them when they must. So this does not signal confusion, it signals priority. And continuity always outranks consistency. Now, once this is understood, a painful realization should set in for you guys. You are not arguing with a moral authority that can be persuaded. You are interacting with the structure that exists to manage outcomes. It does not need to be right. It just needs to persist. And this is why it appeals to fairness. So this is why appeals to fairness so often fail. And this is why exposing contradictions rarely produce reform. The system absorbs contradiction and then it moves forward or moves on. And this is also why chasing sovereignty through constant opposition becomes exhausting. Every interaction requires vigilance. Every encounter becomes a battle. The individual's identity slowly becomes defined by resistance, yet the system remains the reference point for every decision that they make. Freedom becomes reactive rather than grounded, and life becomes a series of confrontations with an authority that never acknowledges defeat. It only delays it. And understanding this does not mean surrender. It just means we have some clarity here. It means recognizing that the struggle is not against isolated laws or flawed procedures, but against a conception of authority that no longer answers to truth. Until that is faced honestly, people will continue to mistake friction for progress and disruption for freedom, never realizing that the system that they are fighting no longer needs to justify itself to survive. Now, once this reality settles in, the question is no longer legal, but existential. If the system is not moral, not consistent, and not interested in truth, then what does resistance actually accomplish? This is where many people either radicalize or disengage because they sense something deeper that has been lost that no filing can actually recover. What they are feeling is not just frustration with government, it is the absence of legitimate authority. And human beings are not designed to live long without it. And this is where the conversation must move beyond courts and into conscience. Authority does not disappear when it becomes corrupt. It mutates. And when moral authority collapses, power does not vanish, it simply detaches from responsibility. The result is a world where rules exist without righteousness and enforcement exists without stewardship. In that environment, people instinctively search for something solid to stand on, but they are often taught to look in the wrong place. Many sovereignty movements promise certainty, right? But they offer scripts, formulas, declarations, and identities that feel empowering because they replace ambiguity with technique. But technique is not grounding. It is exhausting. Hence with Russell-J. Gould. Russell Gould, okay? He tried to bring a sovereign world together through his quantum, not quantum financial system, but through his quantum syntax parsing grammar, which was very clever. And it would have worked if people wouldn't continue to follow the same system that the system is set up to govern, and people still follow that governance, because you're going to have to recruit city by city, and it has to infect like a virus. And he was up against the bankers. I mean, God bless him for standing up against them. And his whole story is just amazing. The CIA capturing him and torturing him and not feeding him for, what was it? He said 60 to 90 days. He didn't eat or drink water. He protested. So his story is amazing. But what I'm talking about is his technique. He didn't ground his technique. And what ended up happening is a bunch of exhausted followers who, some lose cases and some win cases, and they don't seem to see sovereignty or the sovereignty movement actually catching on and picking up steam. And it requires constant vigilance, and they just get tired because they can't do the performance. And they're also facing constant resistance. And it gets tiring, meaning there's a better way to do it. And over time, it hollows people out, and they begin to live in reaction to the system that they oppose, measuring every interaction by whether they won or lost, rather than whether they lived rightly. Does that make sense? Are you living rightly? Are you being true to yourself and others? Or are you fighting a system, trying to expose it and beat it to make a better world for everyone else? Well, what direction are you taking? Are you focusing on all of the symptoms, or are you going straight to the cause? I told you guys from the beginning, the cause of all of our problems are bankers, central banking. Okay, international central banking, period. That's the cause. You have to go after the central bankers. You have to expose them. You have to protest in front of their homes. You have to bullhorn them out from sleep. You have got to literally protest in front of every single banker, central banker worldwide, until they cave into our demands. That's the only way we're going to make change here in this world, because they're the ones that are in control of this world, especially the Bank for International Settlements in Basel, Switzerland. If we don't protest against that entity, then we're never going to get anywhere, because they have been operating in the shadow for so long. And that is the cause. We don't go after the symptoms. The symptoms are starting a sovereignty movement. And I'm trying to help you guys out tonight by understanding that living in reaction to the system that we oppose, well, whether you win or lose, well, it's not going to help you live rightly. And this is why so many who chase sovereignty eventually burn out or actually become very brittle. I get a lot of people that still email me about my Russell interviews, and they're still following him, and they're very vigilant, and they will yell at me, and because they're still there. And there's also some that come to their senses, and they come back to me and they say, man, I was almost like I was in a cult. Well, in a way, it can turn into something like that. Not saying that Russell has any evil purpose for anything. I'm saying that Russell has a heck of a lot of work to do to get that going. And unfortunately, unless he goes after the bankers, he's not going to get anywhere. So their peace during this whole sovereignty movement, it really depends on bureaucrats actually making mistakes. Their identity depends on conflict continuing, and that is not freedom. That is captivity with better vocabulary, and it is still life lived under the shadow of the system, even when the system is temporarily outmaneuvered. Okay, they just figure out a new way around it. And what has been lost in all of this is the distinction between authority and control. Control can be resisted. Authority must be answered. When authority is legitimate, resistance is rare because obedience makes sense. When authority is illegitimate, resistance becomes constant, but it also becomes corrosive. The human soul cannot thrive in perpetual opposition. It needs alignment, not just defiance. And this is where the older understanding of sovereignty quietly re-enters the conversation. Sovereignty was never meant to be seized through cleverness. It was meant to be exercised through right order. And that order begins internally, not administratively. It begins with knowing what one will obey and what one will not, regardless of outcome. It begins with accepting responsibility, even when power refuses to accept accountability. And until that shift occurs, sovereignty will remain an illusion that keeps people busy but never whole. They will win battles and lose themselves in the process. And they will expose systems and still be shaped by them. And they will keep mistaking the absence of restraint for the presence of freedom, never realizing that the deepest form of captivity is living without a legitimate authority to stand under. Now, at this point, the discussion has to confront something most sovereignty conversations avoid, because it cannot be solved with language or tactics. The issue is not whether the system can be challenged. The issue is what replaces it when legitimacy is gone. Human beings do not live well in a vacuum of authority. When no higher order is recognized, power rushes in to fill in the gap. That power may be bureaucratic, technological, or ideological. Could be a religion. But it will always demand obedience without offering meaning. And this is why so many modern systems feel oppressive, even when they claim neutrality. They are not anchored to truth, land, or covenant. They are anchored to continuity. And their highest good is survival, not righteousness. And in such systems, laws are just tools, rights just variables, and people are data points. So sovereignty in this environment is not denied outright. It is redefined until it no longer threatens control. So people are told that they are free while being managed, autonomous, while being tracked, empowered while being constrained. The biblical contrast here is very sharp. Scripture does not present freedom as the absence of authority, but as alignment with the right one. Freedom is not doing whatever one wants. Freedom is being ordered correctly under God. That is why Jesus Christ could stand before Rome unafraid. Rome had power, but it did not have authority over truth. It could command compliance, but it could not command allegiance of the soul. That distinction is everything. And it is this distinction modern sovereignty arguments rarely touch. When people attempt to reclaim sovereignty without addressing this, they unknowingly mirror the very systems that they're trying to expose. They seek control rather than order. They seek exemption rather than righteousness. And they want to stand above authority rather than under legitimate authority. And in doing so, they end up reinforcing the idea that power, not truth, is what ultimately matters and wins every time. And the system recognizes this instinct immediately and then knows how to manage it. True sovereignty, in the older and deeper sense, does not require recognition from courts or institutions. It requires clarity of allegiance. It requires a settled answer to the question of who one obeys when obedience costs something. And this is why procedural victories feel hollow over time. They do not answer that question. They only delay it. And eventually, every person is forced to answer it regardless of how skilled they are with language or law. Now, understanding this reframes everything. Learning the system can be useful, but it is not salvific. Doesn't offer salvation. Resistance and resisting injustice is necessary, but it is not sufficient. Without higher anchor, resistance becomes another form of captivity. The system remains the reference point even when it is opposed. And then life becomes organized around what the system does rather than around what is true. This is the final collapse of the sovereignty illusion. Freedom is not found by escaping authority. It's found by submitting to the right one. And until that is understood, people will continue to search for sovereignty in paperwork, procedures, performances, PowerPoint presentations, online demonstrations, all of it. They'll even go and pay $3,000 to listen to a man talk who stood up against the system. But until that's understood, it's never going to go away. Never realizing that the thing that they are missing was never something the system could ever give them in the first place. And by the time all of this is seen clearly and with clarity, with a common sense, logical sense of mind, well, a difficult but freeing realization emerges. The goal was never to defeat the system. Is that the goal that Russell had? To defeat the system in place? The goal was to stop being defined by it. And as we merge into this technocratic world, as we become a biological entity with a bio-ID system, this is where we need to take the lessons of sovereignty from land and maritime law and the arguments there and start to really hone in on who we are when we start to merge into machine. That is where sovereignty is going to pick up again. And hopefully this time they'll learn where they are grounded from and not attack the system just blindly and without wisdom. So the goal was never to defeat the system. The goal was to stop being defined by it. Most people who chase sovereignty are still orienting their lives around what the system allows, what it denies, what it enforces, or even punishes. Even in resistance, the system remains the axis, as every move is reactive. Every decision is framed by fear of consequence or hope of exemption. But that's not sovereignty. That is captivity, just using better language. And this is why the most honest conclusion is always the least marketable one. There is no technique that restores a corrupted order. There is no filing that resurrects moral authority. There is no declaration that converts management back into stewardship. What can be recovered is discernment, the ability to see clearly what a system is and what it is not. The wisdom to know when engagement is necessary and when compliance is strategic and when refusal is required, even if it costs something. And this is also where responsibility returns to the center of the conversation. Real sovereignty is not about exemption from consequences. It is about choosing rightly with consequences. It is about living in truth, even when power does not reward it. That kind of sovereignty cannot be guaranteed or granted or revoked by courts because it does not originate there. It originates in conscience, in allegiance, and in the refusal to trade integrity for comfort. We as Christians have been living sovereign anyway under our religion of accepting Jesus Christ as our Lord and Savior. That is our sovereignty. That is our understanding of who we are, where we come from. And if you read the Bible says that you are just an ambassador. You are just temporarily placed here to love your neighbor. That does not mean, as an ambassador, you don't follow the rules of the country you're in. That's an important distinction. Conscience and allegiance and the refusal to trade integrity for comfort. And when this shift happens, fear loses its grip. I know I'm an ambassador from the kingdom of heaven. I know I live in Babylon, and Babylon has certain laws, and those laws I must follow. In Babylon, I am not to take a knife and hurt someone with it, right? These are simple laws that were put into place, okay? Now, when Babylon pulls me over, do I act in wisdom, through strategy, or do I follow Babylon's orders? Well, that's where discernment comes in. That's where prayer comes in. That's where you just say, okay, Holy Spirit, I'm just going to let you take the wheel here because I don't know what to say, because I don't know what this officer of the courts wants of me. Okay. And when you start to immediately offer resistance, there's no wisdom there. If you offer resistance, then they're going to get heated and they're going to think that you're not friendly. But if you're an ambassador of the kingdom of heaven, why are you not friendly? You don't belong here. You're just visiting, regardless if you have a license and a passport for this country and state. Wisdom and discernment is everything. And when that shift happens, fear should lose its grip. Who cares? They pull you over. Fine. You get a ticket. So what? What are you holding on to? Do you want the ability to rob a bank and get away with it? No, many people just want to feel like they're not under supervision. And that's where Christianity should not exist with sovereignty, because we are under supervision. We're under a king, and the king has rules, and we must follow those rules. So fear loses its grip when you know that you're from the kingdom of heaven. Why are you worried about trying to take out Babylon? Did God call you a prophet to take Babylon down? Did he tell you to go to President Trump, the current president right now, to whisper in his ear and tell him to repent? No. I mean, maybe. But I highly doubt God's going to send a Jonah, as he's done in the past. The system no longer feels omnipotent when fear loses its grip, because it is no longer the highest authority in one's life. And at the same time, illusions fall away. So there is no fantasy of permanent exemption here. There's no promise of total escape. There is simple clarity, and clarity is enough to live sanely in a disordered world. Now, I was fascinated with sovereignty because I thought it was going to help me not pay my taxes. That's pretty much it. You know, it's like, I don't want to pay income tax. Well, I found a better way. The better way is unincorporated associations. And they set it up legally. And attorneys stand by it. And I didn't have to go to court and argue my way over property taxes and all this other stuff. Saying that you don't have a right to take away my home if I don't pay my property taxes. You see, there's no wisdom in going up against a system that has no morals. And there never will be morals. So why are you trying to morally stand up to an immoral system? And this is where many people misunderstand what is being said here. This is not a call to passivity. It's a call to maturity. Pull the thumb out of your mouth and grow up. They've got a gun as they knock on your window, and they want to see two things: your license and registration. They want to see if you're drunk. They want to see if you're on drugs. I want to see if you've got anything in your car that can help them make their quota. Maturity. If you have things that, should not be in your car, like alcohol or drugs or weapons, that you're not lawfully, approved to carry, well, you are not following Babylon's rules. You are not being a steward of heaven and representing heaven, because you're breaking the laws of a country that you're an ambassador to. Immature resistance believes every battle must be fought and every rule must be challenged. Well, mature discernment understands that not every confrontation is worth the cost. And not every hill is meant to be climbed. But believe me, when you go to a Russell-J. Colin Gould seminar, everyone's pissed and they want to be right and take the system down and stand on top of it like king of the hill. But there's a cost that is paid. Freedom is not loud. Freedom is steady. And it is not proven in courtrooms. It is revealed in consistency of life. Once this is really understood, sovereignty stops being an obsession and becomes a background condition. The system can function without consuming the soul. Laws can exist without defining identity. Power can operate without commanding allegiance. That is the quiet victory that no one talks about because it does not produce headlines or viral clips. But it does produce something far more rare: people who are no longer controlled by either compliance or rebellion. Did any of the Antifa riots solve anything? Did Antifa win a victory anywhere? Did any of the BLM riots, did they win a victory anywhere? Or all it did was just create chaos and damage? Was there any wisdom in any of those protests? Same with January 6th. The January 6th invasion of the Capitol, the crime of the last 250 years. Did any meaningful change happen? Did that protest help America? No. Did any of the protests of Israel before it became illegal to protest Israel on a university campus, did any of that do anything? No. Having wisdom and stepping back and using discernment to understand the times you live in and how to react to every situation is key, along with knowing where you come from. It's either compliance or rebellion for you. And this is the place where illusion finally breaks. Not because the system has been defeated. It hasn't, okay? You're not going to be on world news by defeating the system because you argued your way out of a speeding ticket. Not because the system has been defeated either. Because it has been put in its proper place. And when that happens, the search for sovereignty ends, not in triumph or despair, but in understanding itself. Illusion breaks. And it's not because the system's been defeated. It's only because it's been put in its proper place, because you now have more knowledge and understanding and wisdom to make the correct choices. And when that happens, the search for sovereignty ends. Not in triumph or despair, but in understanding. And that's what happened with me. When I saw all of the paperwork I had to go through and the blue ink I had to buy and I spent like $80 on certain types of pens and certain types of stamps and all. Dude, it was like, I have to do all of this to be free. I'm free already. I have a passport. I can still travel to other countries. But I'm not free to break the own laws of that country because I am an ambassador of the kingdom of heaven. I must follow Babylon's rules. And when Babylon sets the stage of where religion is taken out and it's illegal, and they say that you cannot worship your God, then I must stand up like Daniel did. I must stand up like the prophets. I must be able to worship my God in my way, because that's where I morally stand on, and that's where I do believe I come from, is the kingdom of heaven. That's my real home. I am temporarily visiting here. As an ambassador, I will follow the rules and the laws. I will not break Babylon's rules just because I want to feel like I'm sovereign and I'm free. And I think I've argued the case up until now that there's no wisdom in fighting a system that doesn't want to change. So change can only happen from the inside. People have to want what you have in order to change themselves. And this is why people choose Jesus, not because they're afraid of hell, but through a testimony. People are more interested in a testimony than they are of fear. And what remains after the illusion breaks is not a new ideology here, but a recalibration of life itself. When sovereignty is no longer treated as something to be won or argued or performed, well, attention shifts to what can actually be governed. Time. Is your time governed by Babylon? Or conduct? Is your conduct, the way you behave, the way you act, is that governed by Babylon? And speech. Is the way you speak governed by Babylon? And I'm not talking about social media. Those are private companies with platforms that they own that you are basically giving them information to have license to say something there. That's private. But can you go protest and do whatever speech you want in front of a building that you disagree with? And allegiance. These are not abstract concepts. They're daily choices. And unlike procedural victories, they are not dependent on the cooperation of a system that was never designed to honor them. Is Babylon going to honor you? If they make a mistake and put you in prison because they found evidence against you, and then 20 years later, there's a new machine that proves that you weren't there, is Babylon going to just pat you on the back and say you're sorry and hand you a couple $1 million for your troubles? No. And unlike procedural victories, they are not dependent on the cooperation of a system that was never designed to honor them, period. So once you realize, oh, okay, I'm in a system that is procedural and they just follow order and they have no no morality to it, then you know how to work your way around the system. That's where you have wisdom. And this is where many people quietly regain stability without realizing what just happened. They stop trying to outmaneuver power and start limiting how much access power has in their inner life. It seems to be the goal for a lot of sovereignty people to argue they're strongman. But is there any wisdom in that? Arguing against a immoral, jurisdictional, procedural institution that just follows an order of things without caring about how you feel. They stop trying to outmaneuver power and start limiting how much access power has in their inner life. If you understand sovereignty as I do now, they learn that the system well enough to avoid unnecessary harm, but they no longer expect it to validate them. Let me give you another example. I keep forgetting his name. It probably hit me. He was one of the guys who said that he worked for Trump. And he was on the sovereignty roundup. And David Strait. I even had a cell number. I spoke to him on the phone. I was so into sovereignty, I wanted to help him in his campaign. He declined my offer to work for free for him because he probably was suspicious of me, and that's fine. But David Strait took his sovereignty strawman argument with his wife to court when his wife was accused of something, and her argument didn't even work. She was found guilty and put into prison. And he eventually, I heard, I don't know if this is true or not, don't quote me on it, but that he passed away. Was there any wisdom to David Strait and him saying that what's coming is the great financial reset and the quantum financial system, and Trump is going to give everybody $10 million? Was there any wisdom in that at all? There was none, because he gave a bunch of people hope in a system that is morally corrupt. And he really said that, well, this is all going to change. And then as I dug in, did my research, and as I spoke to Russell when I was on an interview with him, he told me David went to his seminars. Well, we know where he got his sovereignty information from, and it turns out he was a con man. Avel DeGero, sorry if I pronounced that wrong. One of the listeners on live chat says, but what about systems in other countries with less sovereignty or country intentionally murdered like Russia? Discernment plays a key role. If you're not Christian, you are in a country with rules and laws with no morality. And you must use wisdom and discernment to keep you and your family safe. Safe is not getting a bullhorn and interrupting the system for your pride and ego of wanting to be free. There's a time to stand in front of a microphone if you have an audience, and there's a time where you hold back and play it safe for your family. Now, I am a Christian pastor, and I base everything off of Christianity, and therefore that's where I come from, saying that as a Christian pastor, I just act as if I'm an ambassador of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever I do on earth is a representation of heaven, meaning every action that I do here, I am representing that the kingdom of heaven does the same thing. If you try to fight the system that you really don't belong to, what is your real goal? What's your mission statement? What is your cause? Most people who argue the sovereign moment don't have a cause. They just are angry at the system, but they're not attacking the system at its roots. They're just attacking the fruits of what it is. Hopefully that answers your question. It's not about trying to win. We comply where wisdom requires. We resist where conscience demands. And we accept consequence without illusion when truth requires a stand. That posture cannot be gamed by bureaucracy because it is not trying to win. If you are a Christian, then you belong to God. You're fine. He promised he would take care of you and your family. So what are you worried about? Why are you trying to take down one of Satan's countries? He owns them all. He controls them all. Did God tell you to do this? No. If you really felt led by the Holy Spirit to take on your court system and argue the strawman and take your sovereignty to court, by all means do it. If God led you, I would agree, because the kingdom of heaven needs to show something about the corruption there. But in the meantime, if you're not doing it with any wisdom or with the kingdom of heaven backing you up, you're not going to get anywhere. Now, in this posture, fear should lose leverage. And fear only works when the system is perceived as ultimate. And once it is understood as provisional, conditional, and historically unstable, the system, can no longer threaten identity. It can punish behavior, sure, but it cannot define your worth. It can impose costs and penalties, sure, but it cannot impose any meaning. This distinction is subtle, but it's decisive. Most people are not enslaved by laws. They are enslaved by the belief that survival requires constant accommodation of illegitimate authority. And this is also where discernment replaces ideology. Rather than memorizing scripts or clinging to labels or learning law, people learn to read situations. They recognize when engagement will escalate harm and when silence will preserve strength. They understand that some battles are designed to drain attention rather than resolve injustice. And they begin to see what the most powerful act is often refusing to be shaped by: a system's emotional rhythms of panic, outrage, and false urgency. What's the rush? And what emerges here is not rebellion, but quiet independence of mind and spirit. And this is the form of sovereignty that predates nations and will outlast them. Abel says, well, kind of got it, but thank you for your streams. You bet, buddy. God bless you. This is the form of sovereignty that predates nations and will outlast them. And it does not announce itself. It does not require recognition. It does not seek exemption. It simply lives according to a higher order while navigating a lower one with eyes open. That kind of sovereignty is invisible to bureaucratic measurements, which is precisely why it endures. By the time someone reaches this place of peace, they no longer need sovereignty rhetoric to feel whole. They do not need to prove anything to courts, officials, or movements. They understand the system well enough to avoid being naive, and they no longer allow it to be central in their lives. Their life is organized around truth rather than reaction, around responsibility rather than resistance, and around allegiance rather than autonomy. This is the resolution most people never hear about because it does not sell hope through shortcuts. It does not promise escape. It promises clarity, and clarity once gained cannot be taken away by statute, ruling, or decree. So at this point, the conversation comes full circle because the original question resurfaces in a different light. If sovereignty cannot be reclaimed through procedure, if the system is structurally corrupted, and if true authority cannot be conferred by institutions that no longer recognize truth, then why does the illusion persist so powerfully? Well, the answer is simple and unsettling at the same time. The illusion persists because it offers hope without repentance and control without transformation. It allows people to feel awake without changing what they serve. The promise of sovereignty culture is not freedom, it is insulation. It promises protection from consequences without requiring moral reorientation. It offers a way to remain inside the same values, the same comforts, the same priorities, while believing one has escaped the system that enforces them. And that is why it spreads so easily. It does not ask people to live differently. It only asks them to speak differently. And systems built on management have no trouble accommodating language-based rebellion, just as long as behavior remains predictable. And this is where discernment again comes in. It's critical. Not every truth is liberating. Some truths simply rearrange captivity into a more tolerable shape. Learning that the system is artificial does not free someone if they still measure success, safety, and identity by its standards. Learning how to disrupt procedure does not free someone if their peace depends on winning. In that case, the system has merely been internalized. It no longer needs to coerce from the outside. And the deeper loss beneath the sovereignty illusion is not political, it's spiritual. When legitimate authority is rejected without being replaced by a higher one, the vacuum is filled by self-rule. And self-rule sounds noble until it's tested. A person cannot be their own highest authority without becoming enslaved to fear, desire, or justification. And that is why autonomy eventually collapses into anxiety. There is no stable ground beneath it. This is why the ancient understanding of authority matters so much now. Authority was never meant to be horizontal. It was meant to be vertical. When God is removed from the structure of authority, something else must sit at the top. Something, and sometimes it's not the state, sometimes it's the market, sometimes it's yourself. But something always rules. The sovereignty illusion hides this reality by pretending rule itself can be abolished, when in truth, it has merely been reassigned. And once this is seen, the conversation changes its tone. It becomes less accusatory and more sobering. Most people chasing sovereignty are not malicious or foolish. They're just responding to real injustice and real corruption. And their instincts are not wrong. Their target is. They are aiming at the machinery because it is visible, while the deeper issue lies in the collapse of shared moral authority that no court can repair. So by this stage, the listener is no longer being asked to choose sides. They're being asked to choose foundations, not because state and self, or not between them, but between control and truth, between exemptions and obedience, between cleverness and wisdom. And that choice cannot be outsourced, argued, or delegated. It must be lived. So what remains is this, the final clearing of the fog here. The question is no longer whether the system is corrupt. We all know it is. All of them are, worldwide. That has already been answered by history, experience, and observation. But the real question is whether a person will continue to look at a corrupted structure for validation, protection, and meaning, even after recognizing what it really is. And this is where many people stall. They see clearly, but they hesitate to let go. The illusion feels safer than the unknown terrain of living without guarantees. So part of the reason is that the system trains dependency. It conditions people to believe that legitimacy must be granted, that safety must be approved, and that freedom must be recognized by authority to be real. When that conditioning is challenged, anxiety rushes in. People ask how they will survive, how they will protect their families, how will they navigate a world that does not reward conscience. Well, these are not foolish questions, but they're human ones, but they cannot be answered by paperwork. This is where the final distinction must be drawn, guys. Freedom is not the absence of restraint. It is the presence of order. It's not imposed order, but chosen order. A life oriented toward truth does not become chaotic when external authority falters. It becomes clearer, decisions simplify, lines do sharpen, as compromise becomes intentional rather than habitual. Consequences are weighed honestly rather than avoided at all costs. This is not romantic, but it is demanding, and it is reality. So when someone reaches this point, they no longer need to convince anyone of their sovereignty. They no longer need to prove illegitimacy, expose corruption, or even win arguments to feel grounded. They understand that systems rise and fall, laws change, and power shifts. But truth remains unmoved. And they also understand that living under truth does not guarantee comfort or safety. But it does guarantee coherence. And coherence is something that no system can counterfeit. I hope I'm making a lot of sense because I'm enjoying this show. It's good stuff here. This is the quiet end of the sovereignty illusion. Not with rebellion, not with triumph, and not with despair, but with clarity. The realization that freedom was never hidden behind the right words or the right filings, and that captivity was never solely imposed from the outside. What enslaves people most effectively is not law, but misplaced allegiance. When allegiance is reordered, fear loses its leverage, manipulation loses its teeth, and power loses its mystique. The system can still act, still enforce, and still punish, sure, but it can no longer define reality. Not for you. You're truly sovereign because you broke free of feeling like you have to comply to everything that they say and do, and feel like you have to justify yourself by exposing them. It can no longer command the soul or define your reality. And that is the only form of sovereignty that has ever really mattered. Are they forcing you at gunpoint to stop worshiping Jesus? No. So at that point, the choice ends, not because the world is fixed, but because the person is no longer lost inside it. So to conclude, the purpose of this episode was never to take something away from people, but to remove a false promise before it hardens into disappointment. Sovereignty is real, but it is not what it has been marketed out to be. It is not a legal incantation or a filing strategy or a posture adopted in opposition to authority. Those things may disrupt a process, but they do not restore what was lost. Confusing disruption with freedom is how people end up more entangled, not less. The system people are reacting against is not broken in the way that they think it is. It is functioning exactly as administrative systems does when moral authority has been replaced with management. It enforces, adopts, suspends, and overrides without apology. Exposing that reality does not collapse it. Learning how to navigate it does not redeem it either. And defending it in isolated moments does not free a people. It only confirms that the machinery can stall without conceding its legitimacy. But what can be reclaimed is clarity. Clarity about what authority is and what it is not. Clarity about where allegiance belongs. Clarity about the difference between control and order, between autonomy and responsibility. between cleverness and wisdom. When that clarity is gained, the system loses its power to define reality, even if it retains the power to impose consequences. And this is not a call to ignorance, passivity, or surrender. Understanding the law, the structure, and the tactics can be useful, but they're just tools. They're not foundations. They can reduce harm, but not restore sovereignty. They can buy time, but not create freedom. When people stop asking the system to validate them, they stop being shaped by it. And when allegiance is reordered, fear no longer governs decisions. And resistance no longer becomes an identity. So sovereignty was never meant to be seized. It was meant to be lived, not as exemption from consequence, but as fidelity to truth regardless of outcome. That kind of sovereignty does not need recognition, cannot be revoked, and does not depend on winning. It existed before modern states, and it will exist after them. And when that is understood, the chase ends. Not because injustice disappears, but because illusion does. And in the absence of illusion, something rare becomes possible again. An actual life that is more coherent, grounded, and no longer defined by the machinery it must temporarily endure.
Why do 75% of people feel exhausted all the time? The answer might surprise you. In the 1920s, Standard Oil decided to dive into medicine. They pushed synthetic petroleum into our drugs. Sure, it masked symptoms, but it wrecked our guts. Our good bacteria, which fight off parasites and heavy metals, got wiped out by crude oil. But here's the good news. We can fix this by going back to nature. Introducing Elite Potion, the world's top detox program. It restores your good bacteria by removing toxic threats like aluminum, strontium, barium, and parasites. Imagine feeling energized and alive again. They said there couldn't be a pill that did it all. We invented it. Visit elitepotion.com and reclaim your health from synthetic pharmaceuticals. Your body will thank you.
This has been Cause Before Symptom with your host, James Carner. Go to his website, jamescarner.com, and sign up for his newsletter. Also, download his free books on the breath war, the crown of blood, and the ritual machine. Fix your body by buying his award-winning detox formula, removing heavy metals and parasites. You'll feel better and live longer. Go to elitepotion.com. And one more thing, please. Just try and love your neighbor, because if you do, the world would be a better place. See you tomorrow.